we're looking at Myanmar's political and economic awakening. And the talk will be delivered by a person who's well known to me, and perhaps you notice when you're walking up the stairs the funny little wooden placard, and under 1995 you'll see Hans's name there because he was a former president of the Foreign Correspondents Club. Since then he has been a hack, a former lawyer of course, and then moved his way over to the consulting side, where he worked for a large US corporation before 3 years ago setting up his own outfit in Singapore, which now has 60 employees, 10 of which are in fact stationed in Myanmar or Burma. But Burma is of particular interest to a lot of people in Hong Kong, and I recall that there was a time when Burma and the Philippines were rated as the most likely Southeast Asian countries to succeed, while the four tigers were considered hopeless Confucian basket cases. Then in the Burma was the rice bowl of Asia, and everything looked good until the Burmese way to socialism turned Burma into one of the world's most impoverished countries. Then in 1989, SLORC, a wonderful acronym that Hans will probably talk about, was run by what Burton Levin called a xenophobic know-nothing group of people who maintains itself in power only through sheer force. I think on that note I'll invite Hans VRIENS to come and tell you the real story.
Thank you very much for your kind words. By the way, I left Hong Kong 12 years ago, and Marty promised to cut his hair when I would come back. So Marty, on Monday you're going. It's great back. I'm traveling around for 12 years, and I must say, being here, it's clear that this is still the best club in the world. So very good to see that you're all members. I'm going to talk about Myanmar and the remarkable changes that are going on, and if they are for real or not. I can already give you the story. It's for real. How do we do this? So I'm going to talk a little bit first the history, then I'm going to talk about the political change, and then the economy. Sorry, I bring some slides because I actually want to show you a few pictures. And this is one picture. And that shows the map of the region. And why is this important, where China meets India and the Malacca dilemma? Let me explain. First of all, as you see on this map, the location of Myanmar is very strategic, really between India and China. Although there are no roads between Myanmar and India. There is no roads. The Malacca dilemma refers to China's problem. China's problem that it has to import nearly all its oil and gas through the Malacca Straits, so via Singapore. Because this is a political dilemma, because also what's happening in the South China Sea. And the fears China has that someday US or somebody else may cut off the Malacca Straits. So for China, Myanmar, or Burma, whatever you want to call it, the Burmese call it Myanmar, this is a great opportunity to get direct access to the Indian Ocean. So they are building a pipeline right now, which will be opened next year, that will see gas flowing right away from the sea, from a new offshore gas field the Chinese are developing, right into Yunnan province. Next step is an oil pipeline, and after that they also want to build a high-speed railway. And if you ever have been on a Burmese railway, you would realize that's really a revolution. because the trains don't go any faster than they did during the British days. This is somewhat more a close-up picture. Actually, almost 60 million people, and the second largest country in terms of size of Southeast Asia. The biggest, of course, is Indonesia. Let me talk a bit about history, because if we talk about the current changes, they're very difficult to understand without some historical perspective. Why did the general suddenly turn out to be the nice guys? That's really surprising after having behaved so badly for 60 years, as Marty so fine described already. It started to go wrong already because of the British, also there. In 1885, when the British deposed the last king of Burma, and actually what we have seen, and sent him into exile. Actually, they sent the Burmese king into exile into India, and the last Mongol king of India to exile into Burma. Since then, we have seen many failed attempts by Burma to modernize. Time and time again, they tried and they failed. Hopefully, it will work out this time, but they have quite a steep hill to climb, because the country has been completely mismanaged and misgoverned for the last 60 years, 50 years, 60 years. Okay, World War II, very briefly. Actually, this was a forgotten theater, but the fighting was vicious. And why? Because the Allies were fighting to keep China in the war. And to be able to do that, they had to resupply Chiang Kai-shek. And the Japanese were determined to cut the supply line. In the end, they did that. They succeeded in cutting the Burma roads. And then the only way to resupply Chiang Kai-shek was over the hump through the air. But they also had another interest in Burma, the Japanese. They hoped to invade India. And they did. They did invade India, and they tried to invade India because they thought, actually with also partially an Indian army, they hoped that by invading India, India would turn against Britain. They did invade, but they failed. They were badly beaten at the Battle of Impal. So these were large, or the Chindis, large British forces fighting behind the lines. The key point here is that after the World War II, Burma was destroyed, devastated. So contrary to what you sometimes hear, that Burma was the wealthiest country in the late 40s, this is all real nonsense. It had potential, it could export rice, but it was still devastated. And on top of that, the British couldn't really decide what to do with it. Like with so many places, they were bankrupt themselves, at least financially. They originally thought to split the territory, Burma that is, in two, to keep the border areas. And the border areas were all where the minorities live. And there are many different minorities. And many of these minorities had been fighting on the British side during the Second World War. And some of them were also Christian. And the Burmans had chosen the Japanese side and were living in the lowlands. And actually, on top of the picture on the top is the father of Aung San Suu Kyi, Aung San, who had been fighting with the Japanese till a few months before the end of the war, when he also realized that Japan wasn't going to win, and he turned sides. So Burma became independent in 1948. Unfortunately, just before that happened, Aung San, and together with most other members of his cabinet, were mown down, were killed by still an unknown assassin. Independence in 48. Independence, so in the end, Britain decided to leave the place intact and not split the colony into two. And the Burmese reached a compromise, an historic compromise, which would grant a high degree of autonomy for the minorities. This was never honored, and they have been fighting ever since. Only 10 years ago, did the government for the first time make a serious attempt to sign peace agreements. Actually, what we have seen in the last year is a very remarkable attempt. They signed 11 peace agreements. Unfortunately, they're still fighting in the north, fighting the Kachin. And now they are promising them not just peace, but also economic development, which will be more difficult to deliver. So it really went wrong in 1962, where General Ne Win took power. He closed the borders. So they closed the borders themselves. Yes, and they were happy to be left alone. Then he nationalized the economy. He expelled the Indians, and a few 100,000. He was firstly anti-communist. He was even received by President Johnson in Washington. And in 1975, he changed sides and adopted a kind of Soviet-style constitution. He ran the economy completely into the ground and set up a system really as a really closed economy. And to some extent, to a large extent, they still have that system still in place. To give you one example, you can't import unless you first export, because you first have to earn hard currency to be allowed to import. So they're now trying to do away with that, but the system was made, it was really completely mismanaged. This is, the picture on the top is his successor, it's Tan Swe, the strongman after Ne Win. After he took over, he put Ne Win in jail together with all his friends and family. What you have to understand, what's important about Myanmar, is that they don't have an ordinary army. The army is the state. So all government ministers used to be generals. All top officials used to be generals. Now, for the first time, we have revolution. We have civilian ministers, at least some of them. So the army ran a parallel society. That was pretty functioning well. Besides fighting the insurgents, they had good schools, good hospitals. They took good care of themselves. The rest of the country, they really didn't bother with. And they were actually happy to be left alone. I mean, they couldn't be bothered. They were doing pretty well. So they were not too worried about sanctions. I mean, that really affected the people, but not them. Despite this, they still privatized a large part of the economy in '88, because they thought by privatizing it, they would actually benefit from it financially, and they did. But Tan Swe had a dilemma. What would he do after he would retire? Because another strongman would be a major danger to him, because that strongman might do the same as he did to Ne Win. So he decided to divide power between several institutions. First of all, a president, a parliament, political parties. But to be able to do that, he had to create them, because there was nothing of that. There was only the military. So they've been doing that. And that's, now they've been doing that, but to be able to do it successfully, they had to break also two stalemates. One was with the minorities. I just talked about these peace agreements. And the other one is with the opposition, with Aung San Suu Kyi, who had been on and off under house arrest since '88. This was tough. They worked on it for 10 years. And it took an NGO, people in Myanmar, a long time to convince her to accept a compromise. And the breakthrough came when Tan Swe, whom she didn't trust, and rightly so, probably, handed over power to the current president, Thein Sein. He convinced her to really become part of, to do this together. What you can now say that the president and Aung San Suu Kyi will either fail or succeed together. This may sound strange because she is officially leader of the opposition, but she's also part of the system. And the reforms either will succeed or will not succeed, and they will do that together. And by the way, they're also both 66 and not in very good health. So they both, time was running out for her. And contrary to what you often hear in Myanmar is that people were also very eager to see her compromise, because living in an impoverished country forever isn't fun. So they wanted to see change. But the change was primarily domestically driven. Because as I said, the military was quite happy to be left alone. And, but they needed to reach these compromises with the minorities and with Aung San Suu Kyi. Why? Because, if you see the picture at the top, they had an uprising in 1988, and this is the 2008 uprising by the monks. I mean, this is a Buddhist country. If the monks rise up against you and you have to shoot them, it can't be more serious than that. So they realized they had to do something fast. And then the Arab Spring happened as well. So they really felt the pressure. And they went out of their way to woo Aung San Suu Kyi. To give you one example, the picture I just showed you of her father, Aung San, had not been shown in Myanmar for many years. He was taboo. So was she, of course. The president received her at his palace underneath an enormous picture of him. And that picture was printed in the newspapers. The symbolism was clear for everybody. He was rehabilitated, and so was she. So in the end, she decided to throw in her lot with him. Now, of course, why do I, and I say here, the lady refers to Aung San Suu Kyi, is not Nelson Mandela. What I mean by that, they have brought her into the system. That doesn't mean they have decided, just like de Klerk did in South Africa, to hand over power to her. I mean, she may win the next elections in 2015. We don't know yet. And if she wins, she may be allowed, she will probably be allowed to take over. But that's not what the original game plan was, to hand over. She also doesn't have, like Mandela had, the ANC, doesn't have really a strong, no party or no organization. Also no platform that goes beyond justice and democracy. So these are all, so people in Myanmar, often contrary to what you hear Burmese say outside Myanmar, are extremely excited and relieved that this is finally happening. Now, of course, I'm not sure the country is ready for the current stampede of people trying to go in, but we also don't know. The military appointed a number of cronies to run their companies, and they may think they will benefit from the change. We are not sure. Some will not. But so far, what's important is that the reform movement is broadly supported within the government, by the president, by the Speaker of the Parliament, by other people, and there are no clear, there's no faction against it. So they have now a real system with a parliament and a president and division of power. Now they only have to set up another very important institution. They have to set up an independent judiciary. And they're going to set up an independent central bank. Talking about banking, I mean, to give you an idea how backward the country is, they have no banking system. If you go to a bank in Myanmar, if you're going to deposit cash, you bring your own van. Yes, and then you bring some bags of money, and then you deposit the money. And if you want to transfer money to another bank, you take it out again, drive with your van to another bank, and then you deposit it. Or if you go to buy a house, you bring your own van and pay cash. So there is no banking system to speak of, because the generals were really scared of banks after a bank run in 2003. They decided it's better to have no banks than banks that can go bankrupt. Perhaps a lesson for the US in years. So, yes. So it's difficult to imagine, sitting in the FCC, how backward and how mismanaged this place is. And then you have generals. I mean, generals who for over 50 years have been fighting in the hills. And they are being told your exchange rate is a mess, and really was a mess. You have to unify your exchange rate. They say, what do you mean? How do I do that? I have no idea how to do that. I can shoot a gun. So it took the State Department 2 weeks to legally sort out how they could sign a waiver for the IMF to go to Myanmar to give the government policy advice on how to unify an exchange rate. They actually did that. It's a really remarkable change. Because one of the real problems the economy has is that because of its large gas reserves and gas exports, the currency has been rapidly appreciating. And that's not good news if you are a farmer and your wage has gone down as a result by 50%. So they have to manage this. So they have a real executive, a real government, a real parliament that really behaves like a parliament. It's drafting laws, it has committees. There's still the armed forces, of course. But what Tan Swe did as well, and that's very important, to make sure the armed forces are not as powerful as they used to be. He retired all the top generals, all of them. So the current generals who are at the top of the armed forces, because this is the picture of Tan Swe. They used to basically serve his, they used to be his adjutants. He is much senior in rank than they are. So in a very hierarchical society, an army, they can never stage a coup against him. And then for the first time we have civilian advisors. And what's also surprising about Myanmar, that they have a thriving, a very strong civil society. And certainly they have more media freedom than many countries in Southeast Asia, just to mention Vietnam or what about China. And you see the picture of Aung San Suu Kyi on nearly every newspaper, together usually next to a picture of Mr. Ferguson of Manchester United, who's also very popular, but you can't vote for him. So this is a remarkable transition. Now the question is it irreversible? I mean, that's difficult to predict. But I think for the moment not. And why? Because they have raised expectations. Yes, if they would now say stop, then the people really will not accept that. And Tan Swe, the president, when Ban Ki-moon, UN Secretary General, visited Myanmar a few weeks ago, he told him something which is quite illustrative. He said, we can't turn back. The path of reform is so narrow, we can't turn around. That's probably true. They have embarked on a road and they've made decisions. And for the first time, I mean, they are taking into account if this is good for the people or not, instead of just good for the generals, and who cares? So that's why they suspended the building of the big dam that would supply electricity to Yunnan province. They also cancelled a very polluting coal-fired power station the Thais were going to build. The Thais had a great plan. They thought, let's export all our polluting industries to Myanmar. That's a really good idea. And the Burmese said, no, we don't accept it. So this is all very new. So what will be important for success? That's the building of institutions. Yes. And we also have to, and the opposition has to play the role of loyal opposition. And Aung San Suu Kyi fully understands this right now. If she will push too hard, that may lead to a backlash. And she can't afford to spend another 10 years in house arrest. And nobody wants that either. The president is now himself in charge of signing a peace agreement with the Kachin here in the far north. And hopefully this will lead to the end of sanctions. But actually the only country that still has wide-ranging sanctions against Myanmar is the US. And the EU suspended them. And by the way, Aung San Suu Kyi herself is now calling for the suspension of sanctions and also asking companies to invest. This is the only country I've ever worked in where they are desperate for foreign investment, and they say especially Western investment, because the impression they have of Chinese investors that basically came to rape and pillage, in their view, hasn't been very positive. And it's sometimes disarming if they say, we want to rejoin the world, can you help us? Balancing foreign relations. Another important reason for the change was they don't want to be a client state of China. Traditionally, Myanmar, Burma, was one of the leading powers of the non-aligned movement. And they want to be friends with China, India, US, Europe, ASEAN, fine. And especially when the generals traveled around ASEAN. Singapore is their favorite place to shop and have a bank account, because actually there the banks do work. So in many ways, Singapore played the same role as Dubai does for Iran. It's the offshore banking center for Myanmar. And then also when they traveled to Vietnam, they realized they were bypassed by Vietnam. They were just fighting a war in '75. And then they went to Bangladesh. And they said, the Bangladesh used to clean our houses. Now they do better than we. This is no longer acceptable. We have to do something. So they were under enormous domestic pressure to change the economy. And the generals realized one thing. They have no clue how to run an economy. So they stepped back. They really stepped back. And now the economy is run by former generals and the civilian advisors. And they're desperate for advice. Fortunately, the World Bank is coming in. So, yeah, I mean, reliable statistics about Myanmar are few and far between. The official statistics say that the country grows by almost 11% a year. This is a joke. Even the IMF estimate we think is too optimistic, because electricity growth is only 1% a year. The population, we don't even know. Nobody knows if the estimates vary from 54.5 to 64, so around 60 million people. The government spending is relatively low, but they have been running a budget deficit, so the central bank has been busy printing money. The military is still there, but for the first time, they are now substantially increasing their spending on health and education to do something for the people. Because their health system and educational system is really a mess. The economy, they have a surprisingly big private sector, but unfortunately most of the people in point two work as rural farmers and peasants in the informal economy. Yeah, I have to, Martin says I have to stop. I already talked about the financial sector. So this is, so no credit. It's, but Myanmar will, the next few years, will become almost a petro state. They have so much gas, natural gas, that's being developed, that they're going to be quite rich. The question is what they're going to do with the money. Now, for the first, in the past, until now, the money from the biggest gas field that's run by Total and Chevron, yes, Chevron, disappeared. Went to Singapore, generals, whoever, we don't know. Now it's part of the government budget. So some challenges. Corruption is still there, of course. There's no infrastructure. So it's still one of the most challenging environments. But hopefully, and still foreign sanctions with the US. I will just say, so they're introducing all these economic changes, but it's much more difficult and takes much more time than the political change. This was the Pattaya project. Okay, so this is hopefully changing. By the way, so this is how Burma or Myanmar is often seen by the activists. Fortunately, the facts on the ground are changing fast. What I found quite fascinating was that Total is the biggest foreign investor. They run a big gas field. How they are perceived by the Burmese in Burma. And I was quite astonished to learn that it's the most popular company in the whole country. Everybody wants to work for Total. And they greatly admire them for this an investment. So the view within Myanmar seems to be somewhat different sometimes than outside. But hopefully not for much longer. And hopefully also the Burmese diaspora will be able to go back and all build a wealthier Myanmar. I'd like to stop on that note. And I'll take questions from there or here. I'm happy to stand here.
You're more than welcome to sit down. We'd welcome questions from the floor. We've got microphones going around. put up your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. And we implore you to keep your questions short because the time is limited.
This will be quick. I'm Joel Lakin on behalf of IPPF, members of which are interested in the energy power sector. You didn't touch on that much of a role of the overseas refugee population. Huge amounts of people in Bangkok was packed with them through the 70s, 80s. A large amount of Koreans and Kachins and Shans and whatever found very successful careers in America and elsewhere. Are they welcome back with their money and their brains yet? Is that happening?
Yes, they are most welcome. And some of them are already going back. I mean, but it's still a bit challenging in the border areas. I mean, there hasn't been too much economic development there. So one of the biggest challenges for the government will be to bring prosperity there, and not just sign a peace agreement. But yes, so I mean, what we have seen in the past. So they also they released almost 700 political prisoners in the past. Political prisoners that came out of jail, were monitored, were harassed. This is no longer the case. They have called, the president has called upon the Burmese diaspora to come home and help rebuild the country. And I think, and I've seen quite a few people already going back. Some of them are working for us. It's not like with Vietnam, where the South Vietnamese go back to tell the North how to behave. And that wasn't very much welcome. This is very different. And by the way, I absolutely agree with you. The diaspora is very, very big. In Thailand, already in Singapore alone, there are more than 200,000 Burmese.
Okay, Edith?
Edith.
Hi, Edith Terry. Hans, I was in Burma in March for the first time, and one of the things that I found, one of the details that I found strange and bizarre was that anytime you tried to exchange dollars, and dollars and euros were the only currencies taken, you had to make sure that they were absolutely crisp and unmarked.
Yes, yes.
And I could only assume that this was part of a vast collection effort by the generals to amass untraceable bills before moving them out of the country. But do you have any explanation for that?
No. I think they are just no. I think the explanation, Terry, is somewhat less sinister. I think they're just afraid that some of these bills are counterfeit, and I don't know where this is coming from. But why would they be untraceable if they are in that state?
Sorry, I've never been anyplace else where they turn bills back if there was the slightest crease, the slightest marking. And normally, when intelligence services and others, the FBI, wants to trace bills, they mark them in some way. So that's where my conspiracy theory came out.
Very interesting observation. I haven't heard this before, but I'm also puzzled why they turn down so many banknotes you try to change. Because they say this is not real, this may be counterfeit. I don't know.
Okay, we've got one at the front table here, and then we'll turn to you two.
Hi, Hans, Tara Joseph with Reuters. I saw, hello. You had Triumph and Daewoo up there on the board, but in terms of basic manufacturing going in, textile manufacturing, etc., into Myanmar, is it really doable at this point? And what are the biggest challenges for those companies going in?
Textiles, the textile industry is the biggest manufacturing sector in Myanmar. The challenges are lack of electricity, and you can't export to the US. And the US used to be the biggest market until the embargo was announced. But the challenges are lack of, actually, because of the rising wages in Thailand and also in other countries, we see already textile companies moving factories from Thailand to Myanmar. But the biggest challenge is probably unreliable electricity supply.
You talked about reform being so much on its way that it's not possible for them to turn back.
Yes.
Could you maybe comment on which areas of policy they are most focused on and which areas the population are most focused on? So what is it that they have promised or raised expectations on that they have to deliver? Is it health for the population? Is it
Yes.
Exchange control? I mean, what is it? If you could
I think,
comment on that.
I'm not sure in general many people care about, I think many people equate democracy with jobs. So now, after this political change, the ongoing changes, that's why they're so desperate to bring in jobs and bring them quickly, because they understand they have a limited time frame to succeed. And that's why they are also desperate to see the US lift sanctions. By the way, there's really a stampede. There's so many companies already trying to go in, but the US sanctions are a real hindrance. And we don't expect President Obama to spend any political capital on Burma in an election year. Also, because some of these minorities are prosecuted, or at least they say they're being prosecuted, and they're Christian. So there are quite a few Christians in the Congress who will support them. I'm not.
Hello, I'm
Yes.
Marketa Moore from Chinese University. Chinese University students of Master of Global Political Economy just came back from study tour in Myanmar. And we would like to know, because we ask a lot of questions to many different people from different industries.
Yeah.
We try to find out what happened. How come there were these sudden changes, political changes in Myanmar? What was the kind of driving force behind it? Or based on your understanding of your insight, can you tell us what really happened, why these political changes came out? Because when we talk to people in Myanmar, they all were a bit surprised.
Yes,
And they said
sure.
these changes came suddenly.
Yes, it's
and
also
they didn't have very good explanation for them. So I wonder if you can enlighten us on that point.
Yeah, as I said, I mean, yeah, I think it's absolutely correct. Many people were taken, everybody was taken by surprise how that this government certainly dared to go this far and that soon. But as I said, there were a number of reasons why they did this, and most of them were really for domestic political considerations. And they really realized that they had to change because of the economy, and because of the relation with China, and because of the threat of another uprising. And they realized they had to make far-reaching changes. And what you see at the moment, it's quite that the reformers are now trying to outcompete each other. Who's the most reformist? And it's one of the few countries where they really embrace foreign advice and are really keen to get help and understand how they can reform their political system and the economy. But I understand, yes, it was a bit of a surprise.
Okay. We have one at the back of the balcony over here first, and then over here.
Hi, Mitya New, leading organizations. Hi, Hans.
Hey.
Nice to see you.
Thank you.
You touched one of the questions you answered a little bit, or you touched a little bit on political prisoners and the the police state.
Yeah.
Do you think there's a need, or even is it even possible for a truth and reconciliation process in Burma?
Yes. I mean, Brazil just announced today to set up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that will look into the behavior of the generals in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I think it's a bit too early. At some point this will happen, but if we push the generals too hard right now, it may lead to a backlash. Because they were, one of the reasons they set this whole reform process in motion was that they don't want to end up in The Hague or like Gaddafi. So if we push them too hard right now, that may lead to a backlash. Eventually, I'm sure this will happen.
Robin Fox, I'm an associate. What's the Chinese reaction to these changes in Myanmar, and what's the political risk arising from that?
I think the Chinese can't be that happy. I don't think the Chinese were the big promoters for democracy. And they were quite happy to see Myanmar as a client state. But they have no choice. They have to operate within the new reality. And I'm sure they will try to do that. But at the same time, they can't antagonize the Burmese government too much, because it still provides them with access to the Indian Ocean. So the Myanmar is of great importance to China. And by the way, Myanmar also doesn't want to antagonize, doesn't want to have a hostile relationship with China. They just hope that they get different investors than from China.
Okay, we've got one here and one there. I think that'll have to be it. Keep it quick so we can keep moving.
Yes, Dominic Provenzale. I think I'm going to ask you a very difficult question. Hopefully you'll be able to at least give us some insight. You touched on something which I think is very, very important. That's the issue of inflation.
Yes.
So you're clearly seeing that in Yangon,
yes.
Hotel prices doubling in 6 months, things like that.
Yeah.
First question, which I think is easy, is are you seeing that? That's okay if it remains isolated, and it's
yes.
just people in this room that are actually paying twice as much.
Yes.
For products and services. Are you seeing that spread into the rural areas in basic staples? And then the next question is, you know, with this great demand for foreign direct investment, how are they going to be able to manage this inflow of foreign
yes.
direct investment
yes.
without importing the inflation?
Yeah, that's a good. Okay. Let's answer the first question first. The hotels. I mean, that's actually inflation has gone down substantially over the last few years. Yes, it's still about 10%, but 2 years ago it was 20%. Yes, hotel prices have gone up because there are very few hotel rooms. And many hotel rooms were converted into offices in the last 10 years because there were no guests. And now that hotels are trying to get the rooms back, and prices have doubled or tripled if you are lucky to get a hotel room. No, not really. No, what you have seen, the biggest inflation has been in real estate. So Burmese tell you somewhat jokingly that Aung San Suu Kyi's lakeside villa is now worth $50 million. Yeah, and because real estate has been one of the very few ways to invest your money in Myanmar. Then your question about investments coming in. Yeah, that will be a real problem. They have very little capacity to deal with this. Very little. So we will see. But this is a real issue because they have never. I mean, just imagine going from pariah to suddenly. The place where everybody is visiting has been a bit of a shock for them. So we don't know if how they'll be able to manage that.
Okay, last question over here.
Hi, thank you very much. Philippa Symington from FTI Consulting. You mentioned that Obama is unlikely to radically change his stance towards Burma, so I just wondered what's your assessment for the timing of the lifting of sanctions, US sanctions? And the second question, if I may, given the many opportunities in the country and yet the fact that obviously sanctions are still in existence from the US, what can US companies actually legally do at the moment in terms of preparation for getting into the country? Thanks.
Yeah, they're checking with their lawyers what they can do. Actually, US companies are probably, US companies are probably more active than they're willing to admit, at least some of them. but also our US clients have to be are very, very careful what they are allowed to do. So mostly fact-checking, just visiting, but no deals yet, and no setting up operations. But for some companies, they can do it through their Thai subsidiaries. Sorry, the first question was? The timing, wow. Okay, first of all, I mean, there isn't just one set of US sanctions. There's a whole spaghetti bowl of US sanctions for all kinds of different reasons. Against narcotics, Christians, all kinds of things. And many of them have to be approved, have to go through Congress. So that what you see, the paradox is that there's been no government has been more active in coaching the Burmese government on what to say and how to behave. But at the same time, they have the least capacity to lift their own sanctions. They can't even appoint an ambassador right now. So this will probably take, not a year, perhaps even longer. No, it will take years before all the sanctions are lifted. Years. What you will see US, I mean, in 2 weeks, no, next week, the president has to renew a ban on financial transactions. That will be an important litmus test. If he has to actively renew that. So if he will renew that, then doesn't bode very well for lifting of other sanctions. Despite the fact that Aung San Suu Kyi is calling for lifting of sanctions. But you have all these, sorry to say, human rights groups saying, no, we should lift no sanctions because they haven't delivered yet. I mean, what do we expect? That to become first Norway and then we lift sanctions? It's not going to happen. They have no clue. They're desperate for advice and help. So, and I think it's also incredible to deny the people development aid and other assistance. They really need it. I mean, it's a greatly impoverished country, as I said.
Well, thank you very much, Hans. And as a traditional gift from the club, we give you the care package. And thank Hans and thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Martin.